Spring, 1943. The sky over Western Europe shimmers with cold sunlight, a pale ocean of blue streaked by silver contrails. Far below, the ruins of a burning rail yard fade into the haze. Above it, German pilots in sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s scan the horizon. Their radios crackle with laughter. A new American plane has appeared. Thick-bodied, stubby-winged, absurdly large for a fighter. Eine fliegende Milchflasche, one jokes, a flying milk bottle. But the joke ends abruptly. The strange plane turns toward them, and the sunlight glints off 8 black barrels. The air rips apart with the roar of 50-caliber gunfire. Tracer lines slice the sky. One Messerschmitt bursts into flame. Another spirals downward in smoke. Inside the cockpit of the American machine, the pilot grits his teeth. His oxygen mask muffles a single word: Thunderbolt. The plane that once drew laughter will soon rewrite the skies of Europe with thunder. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, the air above Europe already belonged to someone else. The Luftwaffe ruled it. Sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and deadly Focke-Wulf FW-190s carved their initials into the clouds. RAF Spitfires had fought them to a standstill during the Battle of Britain, but even Britain's best could only defend home skies. Offensive daylight bombing, the kind the U.S. Army Air Forces envisioned, remained a suicide mission. American generals believed that precision bombing could cripple Hitler's industry. But to do that, the bombers had to fly in daylight and deep into German territory. They would need an escort that could climb high, fly fast, and fight its way home. Something with the muscle to match a bomber's range and the toughness to survive enemy fire. The U.S. turned to Republic Aviation of Farmingdale, New York. The man behind its designs was a Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli, a quiet genius shaped by exile and obsession. His previous creation, the P-35, had already flown before the war, but Kartveli knew the New World conflict demanded more than refinement. It demanded brute power. In 1940, the Army Air Corps issued a radical specification: a fighter capable of 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Kartveli's solution ignored elegance. He would build an airplane around an engine, a monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial capable of producing more than 2,000 horsepower. To feed it, he attached a giant turbo-supercharger running through ducts and intercoolers that snaked through the fuselage like steel arteries. The result was unlike anything in the sky. Massive, round-nosed, thick-winged, and heavier than any single-engine fighter ever conceived. When the prototype XP-47B first rolled onto the tarmac in May 1941, test pilots were stunned. Empty, it weighed nearly 7 tons, twice the weight of a Spitfire. The landing gear looked agricultural, the propeller nearly as tall as a man. Engineers joked that it would never lift itself off the ground. But when the throttle opened, the Double Wasp bellowed like thunder. The airplane clawed at the air and rose. Its first flights revealed both genius and flaw. It could reach 400 mph, climb like a rocket, and dive faster than anything the Americans had ever built. Yet it burned fuel at a terrifying rate. Its range was barely 400 miles, far too short to escort bombers to Germany. Worse, the cockpit was cramped, visibility poor, and maintenance brutal. Many pilots dismissed it at first sight. "A flying tank," they muttered, half insult, half prophecy. Still, production orders came. The U.S. needed fighters, any fighters. As war exploded across North Africa and the Pacific, Republic's assembly lines thundered into motion. Rows of women riveters worked beneath banners reading, "The jug means business." Each P-47 carried 850 caliber. Browning machine guns, 4 per wing, capable of spitting a hail of lead that shredded aircraft, trucks, and trains alike. Armor plate wrapped around the pilot like a cocoon. Even its skin, heavy-gauge aluminum, could absorb punishment that would tear lighter planes apart. By early 1943, the first P-47 Thunderbolts reached England. The 56th Fighter Group received them with mixed emotions. On the ground, the aircraft dwarfed its crews. In flight, it drank fuel faster than tankers could supply. Mechanics cursed its complexity. Pilots feared its weight. But those who learned its temperament discovered a new kind of power. A plane that could dive through flak, burst out of clouds with 8 guns blazing, and still bring its pilot home even with holes the size of fists through its wings. As Thunderbolts began to appear in European skies, German pilots laughed. To them, it was a clumsy brute, too slow, too fat, too American. Yet beneath that ridicule lay the first tremor of change. The age of sleek elegance was giving way to the era of raw force. And soon, the laughter above Europe would turn to alarm. The first months of 1943 were humbling for the Thunderbolt. When the 4th Fighter Group, veterans of the RAF's Eagle squadrons, received their new P-47s, disappointment rippled through the hangars. They had traded nimble Spitfires for something that felt like a flying anvil. The Jug, as crews soon nicknamed it, took forever to climb. It struggled above 15,000 feet. Its radio systems often failed at high altitude, and the turbo supercharger lagged, creating violent surges of power. Pilots joked that by the time the Thunderbolt reached combat height, the war might already be over. Republic engineers scrambled to correct the problems. By spring, field modifications improved the turboducts and boost controls. Training manuals were rewritten. The pilots learned to use the aircraft's immense weight as an advantage. Dive to escape, dive to kill. The P-47's sheer mass meant that once it pointed its nose down, nothing in the sky could follow it safely. Messerschmitts that dared to chase found their wings tearing apart at 500 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the strategic context was shifting. The U.S. 8th Air Force had begun its daylight bombing campaign over occupied Europe, a bold and costly experiment. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators thundered toward the Ruhr and Hamburg, only to be torn apart by swarms of FW-190s and Bf-109s. Escort fighters could only protect them as far as the Dutch coast. Beyond that, bombers were alone. Every mission ended with charred aluminum raining over the fields of France. The Thunderbolt's early deployments aimed to change that. Though its range was limited, its high-altitude performance made it ideal for penetration escort, meeting bombers on the way back, clearing the skies for their retreat. On April 8, 1943, the P-47 flew its first combat mission over France. It encountered no enemy that day, but the learning began. The pilots discovered how to use its turbo boost to outclimb opponents above 25,000 feet, and how its heavy armor could shrug off hits that would cripple lighter aircraft. As missions increased through the summer, the Luftwaffe began to take notice. German pilots, hearing rumors of a new American monster, were skeptical, but reports soon described a strange new foe that could dive at nearly 500 mph and still pull out intact. Its machine guns, 8 of them, could shatter a bomber or fighter in a single burst. The Luftwaffe's jokes about flying refrigerators began to fade. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt was maturing into its role. The D-Series introduced extra fuel tanks and new paddle blade propellers, boosting climb rate and range. Drop tanks extended its reach deep into enemy territory. Pilots like Hub Zemke, Francis Gabreski, and Robert Johnson emerged as masters of the type, men who discovered that the Jug's bulk was deceptive. In a dive, it was a bullet. In a climb, unstoppable above 30,000 feet. And, in a firefight, nearly indestructible. Stories began to circulate across England. One pilot returned with half a tail, Another with an engine burning, yet still running. Robert Johnson famously flew home after being hit by more than 200 bullets. Oil leaking, control cables shot through. Yet the P-47 carried him back to base. Mechanics stared at the wreck in disbelief. "That's not a plane," one muttered. "That's a flying fortress with one man inside." The Luftwaffe now faced an unexpected problem. Their own fighters, designed for agility and short bursts of combat, could not match the American endurance war. The Thunderbolt could dive, fire, and climb again, over and over, while absorbing punishment that destroyed German planes instantly. By the end of 1943, the laughter was gone. Luftwaffe radio chatter described thick-bodied fighters with impossible speed. German intelligence began calling it der Donnerbolzen, the Thunderbolt. What had seemed a design flaw now looked like destiny. Above the gray skies of Europe, a new sound rolled through the clouds, a deep, mechanical thunder that announced the arrival of America's airborne sledgehammer. The human angle, the pilots behind the jug, the men who first climbed into the P-47. Thunderbolt didn't feel like heroes. They felt like test subjects. Most were barely in their 20s, sons of farmers, mechanics, or factory workers, now standing beside an aircraft that towered over them like an iron monument. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800, could shake the ground before it even left the runway. The cockpit canopy smelled of fuel and oil, and when the engine fired, the entire plane trembled like a caged animal. At first, they hated it. Compared to the sleek Spitfires and P-51s, the Thunderbolt looked like a brute. It wasn't nimble in a turn, it guzzled fuel, and it punished mistakes. But once the pilots learned to master it, the fear turned into trust, then into reverence. They discovered that the Jug could do what few planes could: take punishment and still fly. Many pilots described feeling protected by the aircraft, as if it were alive and loyal. One airman said, "When you heard that big engine roar, you knew you weren't going down easy." For these men, flying the P-47 was not about grace. It was about survival. Missions over France and Germany meant constant flak, swirling dogfights, and icy cockpits where death came without warning. Yet, time and again, pilots returned home in planes that looked like floating wrecks. It forged a brotherhood, not just between men, but between man and machine. The technological angle, the heart of a giant. To understand the P-47, you must begin with its heart. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800. Double Wasp was a masterpiece of mechanical fury. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, displacing 2,800 cubic inches. It produced over 2,300 horsepower, driving a propeller over 12 feet wide. But brute power alone was not the secret. It was how that power was harnessed. The P-47's enormous fuselage hid a complex turbo-supercharger system that allowed it to breathe at 30,000 feet. Air was compressed, cooled, and fed back into the engine with precision unheard of in 1940s engineering. This made the P-47 a high-altitude beast. While most aircraft gasped for oxygen above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt thrived. The turbo system, though bulky, gave it unmatched performance in the stratosphere. It could dive faster than any piston engine fighter ever built. Recorded speeds exceeded 500 miles per hour in combat. The armor layout was revolutionary, too. Republic engineers wrapped the cockpit in steel plate and self-sealing fuel tanks. Even the oil cooler lines were armored. The heavy weight, once mocked, turned into its shield. In effect, the Thunderbolt was the first true armored fighter, bridging the gap between aircraft and tank. Pilots could take hits that would rip apart a Spitfire or Mustang and still make it home. Stories of planes landing with cylinders missing or wings shot through with holes large enough to crawl through became legend. Maintenance crews at airfields across England began to realize that the Jug didn't just fly through fire, it endured it. The tactical angle, rewriting air combat. Tactically, the Thunderbolt changed how America fought the air war. It wasn't built to dance. It was built to strike, climb, and dive. Pilots were taught new tactics. Boom and zoom. Dive fast, shoot once, climb back into the sun. No turning duels, no chivalry. Pure velocity and firepower. The Jug could outdive anything the Luftwaffe had. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that tried to follow simply broke apart. Its 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns could fire 100 rounds per second. A single pass could shred a bomber formation or slice a locomotive in half. When those guns fired, the recoil shook the entire frame. Pilots said it felt like riding a thunderstorm. This firepower, combined with durability, made the P-47 perfect for the new style of warfare America was embracing. Air supremacy through attrition. Rather than chasing glory in dogfights, the Thunderbolt's job was to kill the Luftwaffe by destroying its ability to fight, its aircraft, fuel depots, and transport lines. By mid-1943, American commanders understood the Jug was not a duelist, it was an executioner. It was the hammer of air strategy. A formation of P-47s could sweep across enemy territory, pulverizing anything that moved. As Luftwaffe aces complained about indestructible American fighters, Thunderbolt groups learned that every dive, every burst, and every mission was wearing down Germany's air defense. One train, one convoy, one pilot at a time. The war of finesse was ending. The war of thunder had begun. The enemy's perspective, when laughter turned to dread. At first, the Luftwaffe saw the P-47 as a joke. When the Thunderbolt appeared in 1943, German pilots were flying the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109G and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A, machines that embodied German engineering, compact, agile, and deadly. Against them, the P-47 looked like a lumbering truck. Radio chatter often mocked its shape. Big as a bomber, slow as a cow. But that confidence began to fade as encounters multiplied. Luftwaffe veterans were stunned by the Thunderbolt's dive speed. A Bf-109 could not safely exceed 480 km. Its control surfaces stiffened, and its wings risked tearing away. The P-47, by contrast, could dive past 500 Manitraumf and still pull out clean. German pilots who tried to follow often never returned. Then came the shock of firepower. 8 50 caliber Brownings could turn a fighter into vapor in a single pass. Pilots of JG-26. The Abbeville boys, among Germany's elite, reported seeing their comrades' aircraft explode from head-on attacks. The Jug's bullets did not merely pierce, they disintegrated. And worst of all, it refused to die. In air combat, German aces prided themselves on precise marksmanship. But hits that would cripple a Spitfire barely scratched the P-47. Some Luftwaffe reports described Thunderbolts limping home, streaming oil, riddled with holes, yet still under control. That defiance unnerved even the most confident pilots. By late 1943, the P-47 had earned a new nickname among German flyers, Der Bulldozer. It was not graceful, but it was unstoppable. The same laughter that once filled their radios now turned into terse warnings. Achtung! Donnerbolzen! Before disappearing under gunfire. The moral and psychological angle, from doubt to devotion. Inside Allied bases. The Thunderbolt's early reputation as an ungainly Jug slowly transformed into reverence. Pilots who once begged for lighter aircraft began to refuse transfers. They had learned that, in the maelstrom of war, survival meant more than style. The psychological shift came from experience. Every mission over Germany tested nerves. Endless flak, ice forming on canopies, sudden ambushes out of the sun. The Jug's toughness became its own kind of morale weapon. Crews knew that if they were hit, they had a fighting chance to make it back. That knowledge built confidence, and confidence bred aggression. Some pilots began personalizing their aircraft with nose art that captured the Thunderbolt's personality. The big-ass bird, Hun Hunter, Oh Johnny, Little Chief. Each painting was a declaration of defiance. "The Jug looks after you," they'd say in mess halls, half joking, half serious. The camaraderie spread beyond squadrons. Ground crews developed pride in maintaining what they saw as the most rugged fighter of the war. Mechanics would tap the thick aluminum skin affectionately before takeoff. The P-47 was no longer an underdog, it had become a talisman, proof that engineering strength could save lives. Psychologically, the Thunderbolt also changed how Americans perceived air combat. Before, the ideal pilot was the duelist, a man of elegance and precision, like the Knights of the Air in World War I. The P-47 replaced that romantic image with something new. The industrial warrior, efficient, methodical, powerful. It was America's character translated into metal. The strategic angle, forging the air hammer. The Thunderbolt's greatest impact was not just in dogfights, but in how it reshaped Allied air strategy. By late 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force faced a grim equation. Every deep-strike bombing raid over Germany cost dozens of bombers. The Luftwaffe's defenses, radar-guided interceptors, flak batteries, and disciplined fighter wings, inflicted catastrophic losses. Air superiority seemed distant. Enter the P-47 in mass formations. Equipped with drop tanks, Thunderbolts could now escort bombers deeper into occupied territory. Not all the way to Berlin yet, but far enough to blunt the Luftwaffe's attacks. They flew above and ahead of the bomber streams, pouncing on enemy interceptors before they could close. The Thunderbolt's turbocharged engine allowed it to climb faster than any escort before it, giving Allied bombers a protective dome of steel and speed. American commanders quickly recognized the opportunity. By early 1944, the 8th and 9th Air Forces began using Thunderbolts not just as escorts, but as air artillery. Missions expanded from air-to-air combat to ground attack. Railways, fuel depots, bridges, and convoys. The Jug's structural strength made it ideal for low-level strikes, where flak shredded lighter planes. Armed with rockets and bombs, it became the scourge of German logistics. General Karl Spaatz described the new doctrine succinctly: "Break the Luftwaffe, break Germany." And the P-47 was central to that plan. Every destroyed train or airfield meant fewer supplies reaching the front, fewer aircraft taking off to defend the Reich. As the Thunderbolt carved fiery trails across Europe, the psychological tables turned. German civilians who once watched confident Luftwaffe formations overhead now saw smoke columns rising from their towns. The mighty German air arm that had once terrorized Europe was bleeding to death from above. The laughter that had greeted the Thunderbolt's debut was gone. Only thunder remained. By early 1944, the war in the air had reached a fever pitch. For years, the Luftwaffe had fought on equal footing, confident, lethal, disciplined. But now, the tide was about to turn. The Americans were ready to gamble everything on one massive campaign, the destruction of Germany's air power once and for all. They called it Operation Argument. History remembers it by another name: Big Week. From February 20th to 25, 1944, the skies over Germany erupted in the largest air battle the world had ever seen. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators streamed toward Leipzig, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt, factories that built the backbone of the Luftwaffe. The bombers were escorted by swarms of fighters, P-38 Lightnings, P-51 Mustangs, and above all, the P-47 Thunderbolts. For the pilots of the Thunderbolt groups, the 56th, 78th, and 353rd Fighter Groups. This was the moment of truth. Every lesson learned in frustration, every modification, every ounce of muscle built into the jug would now be tested in combat. The weather was merciless. Ice-glazed wings, clouds swallowed entire squadrons. Radar screens on both sides pulsed with signals. Above the gray ocean of cloud, German controllers directed hundreds of interceptors, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even experimental Me-410s toward the incoming American Armada. The Luftwaffe still believed in their mastery of air defense. They climbed in disciplined formations, confident that the heavy American fighters would falter once again. But this time, the sky did not behave as expected. As the German formations reached altitude, the Thunderbolts were already waiting. Their turbo-supercharged engines thrived in the thin air. Diving from above the bombers, the P-47s unleashed devastating attacks on the interceptors before they could even form up. 8 50-caliber guns opened in synchronized fury. A curtain of fire that tore through enemy wings. Pilots described it as a flash, then vapor. Within hours, the battle stretched from horizon to horizon, contrails twisting like white scars across the heavens. The roar of engines and the rattle of machine guns merged into a single endless thunder. Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, led his men through wave after wave of German interceptors. Zemke had spent months refining the group's tactics, breaking tight formations, encouraging individual aggression, and perfecting the boom and zoom style that suited the jug's power. That day, it paid off. Thunderbolts dove from 30,000 feet in pairs, bursting through enemy groups, firing short, brutal bursts, then climbing again. German pilots trying to chase found themselves in vertical dives they could not control. More than one Bf-109 disintegrated before the eyes of its pilot. American radio chatter filled with calm professionalism. Splash 1 bandit. 2 confirmed. Zemke's wolf pack moving to cover bombers. In less than a week, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of fighters. Factories at Gotha, Schweinfurt, and Augsburg were pounded into rubble. Thousands of trained ground crew and pilots were gone. The German air arm, once the terror of Europe, had suffered its first true collapse. The P-47's performance shocked both friend and foe. In dogfights, it proved nearly indestructible. One pilot, Lieutenant Francis Gaby Gabreski, recalled a mission where his aircraft was riddled with cannon shells. A cylinder shattered, the tail shredded. Yet he brought it home safely. He went on to become one of America's top aces, with 28 victories. Others told similar stories. Planes returning with flaps missing, holes the size of fists in their fuselage, or engines coughing black smoke, and still landing. Mechanics began to refer to the jug as a pilot's insurance policy. To the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare. German commanders noted in after-action reports that the American heavy fighter cannot be destroyed with ordinary armament. The psychological blow was severe. For the first time, the defenders of the Reich realized they were losing not just aircraft, but confidence. During Big Week, Allied losses were heavy. Nearly 300 bombers and fighters destroyed, but Germany's losses were catastrophic. Over 600 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Luftwaffe's backbone had been broken. For the pilots of the P-47, it was vindication. The flying milk bottle, that once drew mockery had become the war's iron hammer. They returned to their bases exhausted, faces blackened with oil, hands trembling, but alive. And behind them, the ruins of German industry smoldered beneath a sky that no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The Americans had seized the air, and the Jug had delivered the thunder. The summer of 1944 was the season when the P-47 came down from the clouds and began to change the very landscape of war. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe had been shattered, but not yet finished. German fighters still prowled the skies, and on the ground the Wehrmacht prepared for the inevitable Allied invasion. In England, fields once filled with bombers were now crowded with rows of Thunderbolts fitted not with drop tanks, but with bombs and rockets. The Jug was about to become something new, a flying artillery piece, from escort to executioner. When Allied troops landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the sky above them vibrated with the roar of radial engines. Waves of P-47s swept over the beaches, strafing gun emplacements, blasting convoys, and smashing bridges behind the German lines. Each carried a pair of 500-pound bombs or 10 5-inch rockets. More destructive, power than some light bombers of just a few years before. The Thunderbolt's armor and radial engine made it ideal for this brutal work. Flak burst around them in black blossoms and tracers climbed from the hedgerows, yet most Jugs returned home. Pilots learned to come in low, attack fast, and climb away before enemy guns could track them. The plane's immense weight gave it stability in a dive. It could drop from 10,000 feet almost vertically, release its load, and still pull out safely, while lighter fighters would disintegrate. German ground troops quickly learned the sound. The deep, throaty growl of the R-2800 was unmistakable. Tank crews hearing it called for cover instinctively. "Jabos! Jabos!" they shouted, the dreaded German nickname for Allied fighter-bombers. Within weeks, roads across northern France were littered with burnt-out trucks and smoldering half-tracks, their twisted hulks marked by the scorch lines of Thunderbolt rocket strikes, the hunters of the low sky. One of the first to master this new form of warfare was Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke's Wolfpack. Having broken the Luftwaffe in the air, Zemke's men now turned their fury on the ground. Their missions read like industrial demolition schedules: locomotives at Amiens, bridges over the Seine, tank columns outside Caen. Each day they flew dozens of sorties, often returning with their gun barrels scorched and wings blackened with soot. The Jug's heavy frame could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters. Pilots returned with chunks of flak embedded in their armor or holes large enough to see daylight through the fuselage. Yet they came back. As one airman wrote in his logbook, "If you want to come home, fly the Jug." The statistics were staggering. In the first month after D-Day, P-47s destroyed more than 1,500 vehicles, 700 locomotives, and 1,000 rail cars. German reinforcements trying to reach Normandy moved only at night. Even then, the sudden growl of engines in the darkness meant death could strike from above. The Luftwaffe, reeling from losses, could no longer contest the skies. The battlefield now belonged to the Thunderbolt. Stories of survival and fury. The Jug earned its myth through the men who flew it. One pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Knight, led repeated attacks on heavily defended airfields in April 1945, destroying 16 enemy aircraft on the ground before being hit himself. With his plane crippled and fuel nearly gone, he refused to bail out, trying to bring it home to save his squadron's precious fighter. He crashed and died near his base, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Others lived to tell tales that bordered on impossible. Robert S. Johnson once fought off 21 enemy fighters alone, his plane torn to pieces, the canopy jammed shut, blood on the instruments, and still he landed safely. His squadron mates counted 21 holes in the cockpit armor. Johnson simply patted the fuselage and said, "She brought me home." These stories spread like folklore among pilots and ground crews, shaping the Thunderbolt's legend as the unkillable machine. Where the P-51 Mustang symbolized elegance, the P-47 embodied endurance, the brute will to survive and strike again. Thunder across Europe. By autumn 1944, the Thunderbolt had become the hammer of the Allied advance. As American and British armies pushed through France toward the Rhine, squadrons of jugs cleared the roads ahead of them, hunting anything that moved. Tanks, trains, trucks, even horse-drawn carts. Nothing was safe. The Luftwaffe tried to respond with new jets and rocket fighters, but fuel shortages and inexperience doomed them. When the Me-262 jet finally appeared, Thunderbolt pilots simply ambushed them during takeoff or landing, strafing the runways until no aircraft could leave the ground. By December, as the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the snow-covered Ardennes, the weather grounded all aircraft for days. When the skies cleared, the Thunderbolts returned with vengeance. In 1 week, they destroyed over 1,200 German vehicles, halting the counteroffensive. The P-47 had become more than a fighter. It was an instrument of total air dominance. Pilots described the feeling of diving through flak as almost spiritual, a terrifying serenity where the world became a tunnel of smoke and fire. One recalled, "You didn't hear explosions anymore, just your heartbeat and that engine. You rode the thunder." When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Thunderbolt had written its own legacy in the smoke above Europe. More than 15,600 were built, and together they claimed 3,152 enemy aircraft in the air and over 6,000 on the ground. It had been mocked as a milk bottle, cursed as a monster, and feared as a storm, but in the end, it was the machine that broke the Luftwaffe's back and paved the way for victory. The laughter that once echoed through German radios had long since vanished, drowned out by the eternal growl of the Jug's engine as it thundered home. When the thunder stopped, Europe was a graveyard of steel. The once mighty Luftwaffe lay scattered across the continent. Burned airfields, twisted fuselages, and half-buried wings poking from the snow. In just 18 months, Germany's proud air arm had gone from terror of the skies to a memory. The P-47 Thunderbolt had played a central role in that destruction. By early 1945, Allied air supremacy was absolute. Where once hundreds of Messerschmitts had risen to challenge the bomber streams, now only a handful scrambled, often flown by exhausted boys barely out of flight school. The Luftwaffe's elite aces were gone, replaced by the frightened, the inexperienced, and the doomed. Fuel was scarce, spare parts non-existent. Many German aircraft never even took off. They were bombed before leaving the runway, usually by Thunderbolts. The numbers tell the story. The statistics were staggering. Between 1943 and 1945, P-47s destroyed more than 86,000 rail cars, 9,000 locomotives, and over 6,000 armored vehicles. On the ground, they obliterated troop columns, bridges, and supply depots from Normandy to the Rhine. In the air, they claimed 3,752 confirmed kills, but numbers alone didn't tell the full story. The Thunderbolt's real victory lay in attrition, the slow, methodical bleeding of the Luftwaffe's strength. Every destroyed train meant fewer supplies. Every wrecked truck meant one less tank at the front. Every pilot forced to bail out meant another irreplaceable loss for Germany's shrinking pool of veterans. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an organized force. Most surviving aircraft were hidden in forests or abandoned in fields. Allied reconnaissance photos showed entire airbases filled with derelict machines. It was a technological extinction, executed not by one decisive battle, but by relentless, daily destruction from above. The human cost. For the men who flew the Thunderbolt, victory came at a terrible price. Thousands of pilots never returned. Even the Jug's legendary armor couldn't save everyone. Flak, weather, and sheer fatigue claimed many more than enemy fighters did. Those who survived often spoke with haunted detachment, their pride mixed with guilt at having lived when so many hadn't. Yet among the Allied ranks, the Thunderbolt inspired fierce loyalty. Pilots kept photos of their aircraft long after the war, remembering them not as machines, but as partners. Many visited the wreckage of their old planes decades later, standing silently beside corroded aluminum, tracing bullet holes with their fingers. One veteran simply said, "That airplane carried my soul through hell." The end of the Luftwaffe. German generals later admitted that the turning point had come not in any single air battle, but in the unending pressure of Allied air power. They called it der Luftkrieg ohne Pause, the air war without rest. Factories bombed by day, supply lines cut by dusk, tanks destroyed by night. By 1945, Hitler's armies were fighting blind, deaf, and starved. In reports captured after the war, Luftwaffe officers referred to the Thunderbolt as das unzerstörbare Tier, the indestructible beast. They noted bitterly that even when shot down, it usually burned intact, too heavy to die gracefully. For the Allied command, the Jug's success validated a new doctrine, air superiority as the foundation of victory. The Thunderbolt proved that wars could be won not just by capturing territory, but by destroying the enemy's ability to move, fight, or even breathe. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. What had once been a battlefield was now a highway of contrails stretching east toward Berlin. The Thunder had done its work. By mid-1945, the Thunder had quieted. Allied bombers now flew unescorted across skies once filled with chaos. On the airfields of England and France, rows of Thunderbolts sat in silence, their paint scorched, their noses blackened with gun residue. The war they were built for had finally been won. Yet even as peace returned, a new chapter for the P-47 was beginning. One not written in combat reports, but in memory. The passing of the torch. In the final year of the war, the sleek and elegant P-51 Mustang had begun to take over the long-range escort role. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it unmatched range and agility, allowing bombers to reach Berlin and back. For many, the Mustang became the symbol of Allied air superiority. But among the veterans, there was quiet disagreement. "Sure, the Mustang looked good," one pilot said years later. "But if I had to bring her home on fire, I'd still want to be in the Jug." The Thunderbolt remained beloved for what it represented: survival. It wasn't the fastest or the prettiest, but it was the most loyal. It had carried men through the worst air battles in history and returned them, alive, to Earth. In a war measured by losses, that loyalty meant everything. Even as production of newer fighters continued, Republic's factories built the final Thunderbolts, more than 15,600 in total, the most massive American fighter run of the war. Some were shipped to the Pacific, where they pounded Japanese positions from Saipan to the Philippines, earning new respect in a different theater of war. Others stayed behind, repainted and renamed for post-war air forces around the world. France, Brazil, Mexico, Italy, and even Yugoslavia. Wherever it went, the Jug carried the same reputation: unstoppable, dependable, brutally efficient. The bond between man and machine. After the war, pilots often struggled to explain why they felt so attached to a machine that had nearly killed them so many times. For some, it was gratitude. For others, reverence. Hub Zemke, the famed commander of the Wolf Pack, said it best: "The P-47 was never graceful, but she was honest. You always knew what she'd do." and if you treated her right, she'd bring you home. Francis Gabby Gabreski kept a small piece of his old Thunderbolt canopy in his home until his death, calling it his lucky armor. Robert Johnson wrote that when he first touched a P-47 years after the war, the smell of oil hit me like memory itself. For the men who flew it, the Jug wasn't just a tool of war, it was a guardian, a partner forged in fire and flak, whose rumbling engine became the heartbeat of their survival, a legacy cast in thunder. The P-47 story did not end in 1945. In Korea, Latin America, and even the early Cold War, the Jug continued to serve as a ground attack platform, dropping bombs on new battlefields long after jets had claimed the skies. Its thick skin and rugged engine still made it relevant in a world racing toward supersonic flight. But beyond service life, its legacy endured in something far more profound: what it symbolized. The Thunderbolt embodied a generation's belief in resilience, in building machines not for beauty, but for endurance. It represented America's industrial might, the power to take ridicule and turn it into domination. Where the Luftwaffe had laughed, history now echoed with respect. Today, a few surviving Jugs still fly in air shows, their engines growling across the decades. When the propeller spins and that familiar thunder rolls through the air, old pilots look up and smile, because for a heartbeat, they're young again, climbing into that armored cockpit, hearing the world fade beneath them. And somewhere high above, in the quiet after the thunder, you can almost hear the whisper that defined them all. She always brought us home. When the guns went silent, the skies over Europe carried a strange echo, not of engines, but of memory. Among the many machines that had filled those clouds, one stood apart: the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was never elegant, never graceful, never the darling of the headlines. Yet it became something greater, the embodiment of power shaped by necessity, courage carved from steel. The Thunderbolt was born from desperation, a world at war, engineers pushing metal beyond its limits, pilots betting their lives on faith and design. It was a weapon, yes, but also a declaration that survival could be engineered, that endurance was a form of victory. Every bolt and rivet told a story of men who refused to yield, the pilots who dove through flak until their wings glowed red, the mechanics who patched bullet holes through the night, the engineers who built an aircraft so tough it outlived its enemies. In their hands, the flying milk bottle became thunder itself. History often remembers beauty, the Spitfire's elegance, the Mustang's grace. But the Thunderbolt taught a different lesson. That war is not won by perfection, but by persistence. That strength, not speed, is what endures when the world begins to break. And as decades passed, its growl became myth, a sound carried in stories, in air shows, in the hearts of the few who still remember what it meant to ride a storm and live to tell it. Somewhere, far above the clouds of time, the Jug still flies, heavy, defiant, unyielding. A thunderclap of history reminding us that laughter fades, but endurance lasts forever.